uh, had a conversation a couple months ago with Andrew, and basically we were talking about, trying to learn from the prototype in making a track arrangement, for smooth operation. And I'd had an engineer in real life here, and a friend of his that also worked for the railroad. And, he was switching the town of Winchester. And, as we were going through, he says, well, where's your short runaround? And my question was, well, where's my what? And he says, your short runaround, if you only have to run around one car, you're not going to make the crew run the entire length of the town just to do that. And I'm thinking, well, if you say so, sort of deal. And I said, if there was a crossover, and I pointed out on the layout, if it was a crossover right here, would that do what you needed? And he says, yeah. He said, I bet if you go back and look at the track diagram that you said you followed, you'll find one in there. I said, well, I don't have to go back and look at it. I know there was one there, but there was a reason why I didn't put it there, and which I'll explain later on. But he says, well, you need one there. So I built one there. And the same token, down at the end of the line at Strasburg Junction, there was a fellow who operates here occasionally who had worked at various times for both NS and CSX and had gone there in real life. And his comment was, well, I always feel the way you've got it arranged, I always feel like I'm showing up on the Southern from Harrisonburg. I'm thinking, well, that's not good. So eventually, after about 3 tries, I rebuilt it for the 4th time. And the 4th time, I rebuilt it the way it really was. And everybody's happy with that, including me. At any rate, the picture you're looking at here was taken in 1943 by a gentleman who lived in Washington, D.C., named Leonard Rice. Some of you may have heard of him, may have met him. And he would go out on vacation every summer and spend a week at Hilltop House in Harper's Ferry. And this is the view from Hilltop House. Color pictures of steam on the Shenandoah Division are basically non-existent. So this is probably as close as we're going to get there. I threw this in because I thought I'd talk a little bit just about some of my, growing up with railroads type of thing and why I think the way I do. And, one of the places I used to go a lot with my father when I was, knee-high to a grasshopper was Germantown. And we would visit the agent there. If you ordered something from the Sears Roebuck catalog and you checked freight on the order blank, this is where it would show up. And this is at Germantown. And you'd go in and, you'd go in and see the operator, and it was quiet. And it would always smell like the kerosene heater in there, and, the ticking of the clock. And by contrast, you'd go up and visit the mill office, and then, you take the little 5 or 6 year old kid, by the hand and tour through the mill, which you could do in such places in those days. And the first thing you encountered when you went in there was a diesel engine that powered the thing, which was a little frightening. And there were these things that would go by outside that were loud and noisy and frightening too. So anyhow, Gaithersburg, most of you know where this is. Back in, I'm going to say around 1960, they built a new junior high school in Gaithersburg. And I was in the 8th grade and had a math class sometime in the afternoon, sometime probably around, I'm going to guess around 2 o'clock or something. And it was on the second floor, and you could look between a couple houses and see the tracks. So I probably didn't pay as much attention to math class as I was supposed to, but I did note that almost every day you would see the local engine going east with a couple of cars to switch a couple mills that were in Washington Grove. And so I probably spent more time paying attention to that than math. But, you know, later on, when I was going to Montgomery College, I'd come out here and I would stop and just watch the local crew switch. And that was fun thing to do. And you talk to the crew sometimes. And one of the things the conductor pointed out is that, you know, sometimes you come up here and they would just go into the siding and disappear. And he pointed out that if he didn't get in there by a certain time, he would, the term he used, bump number 9. And if you did that, you, the next day you would be going up to Baltimore to explain yourself. Now, number 9 was a train that left Washington around 1 o'clock every day, had a lot of mail and express on it, and a couple of coaches, but it was mostly a mail and express train when it was a moneymaker. And if you delayed that, you were in trouble. And this all kind of goes back to, it explains why I would always see the guys working at basically the same time, because they would come up here and hide in the siding and let that passenger train by. And then if it was, you know, coast was clear, they could get out and do their work. So anyhow, what you have here a little bit later on, I think this was January 1970, you know, they've left their train on the main line. Apparently they had some time before the passenger train was due, or, you know, looking at the sun angle, it could be that the train was long gone. And they're just backing up. That's the old Bowman Brothers mill. The team track was behind it. If they were, the siding here also served as the industrial track for Bowman. So if there was something in there, they had to couple to it and push it ahead when they were clearing up for number 9. And, you know, just doing their daily work. But there was always a kind of a rhythm to it. You kind of knew what was going on. They knew what was going on. There were no gimmicks or tricks in the track work or gotchas or anything like that. You know, by gimmicks, I mean the old trick of, you know, having a switchback siding with room for one engine and one car on the tail track, which means you have to artificially do 5 moves if there are 5 cars in there, and 10 moves if you have 5 cars to pull out. That sort of, there was none of that kind of crap going on. It was just straightforward work. There was a rhythm to it. It was around the, you know, scheduled around the passenger train. If they knew there was they would get on the phone to the operator at QN. If they knew something was coming, you know, they would be alerted to stay out of their way. But generally they could, you know, get their work done. You know, sometimes they would even go to Germantown, and they would have to make 2 trips to Germantown, which one to drop a flag, and then they would go back on opposing against traffic on the double track, protected by the flagman. That way, you know, hopefully avoid a wreck. And so they would go about their business, and here they are, you know, continuing to switch. There was a tank car there that probably come out of Washington Gas Light there. You know, here they are going around to pick up a car on the Y track. And then there was plenty of room on the Y track as a tail for a switchback into southern states. They didn't always be as careful as they should have been there was no 270 in the early 50s. This is not my picture, but obviously they got a little rambunctious with their switching or shoving this car in there and got away from them. And that's US 240, which is now 355, and there's not much going on here at the moment. One of the things that you often would see at Gaithersburg, which I've always found fascinating, were, you know, the helpers would cut off here. They'd come up and, you know, the conductor would pull the pin, the helper engine would stop, and it wouldn't stop, but it would stop shoving. And if they drift away, as soon as they drifted away, the air hoses parted, and it would go in emergency, and it would stop, and the train would continue on to Washington and Baltimore. And of course, after all that's gone, you know, local would have been maybe in hiding in the Y track, and they would pull out and head to Washington, which was where they were based. Another place I spent a lot of time watching trains was Frederick, and again, just an interesting yard and a place that maybe I should have modeled instead of what I did. Lots of neat little scenes there. What I find interesting here is that you have a DT&I boxcar shoved between these two old stone warehouses, both of which were built prior to 1776. And I think it's amazing that they're still rail served in 1969 or 70, whenever this was taken. An interesting place. You know, a lot of business on the team track. Western Maryland Wholesale was once served by the H&F, but the H&F was gone by 1970. Buffalo Creek boxcar, we can guess that maybe this had flour in it, but who knows. Maryland Virginia Milk Producers was a co-op that served farmers. I remember going to their warehouse with my father, again, back in the 50s. And they were kind of like the company store for dairy farmers. If you bought something there, it was just taken out of your milk check. You know, interesting yard. If you follow the track to the left, an ancient section house that dates to God knows when. And then you turn around or back up a little bit, and here again is a switchback. But there were two canning factories up here, and Dietrich and Gambrill feed mill. But again, you could put 3 cars back in the switchback, but there was plenty of tail track. You didn't have to switch them in one at a time. It was just, they weren't messing with you. And then turn around the other direction, you have Dietrich and Gambrill, another canning factory, and then a grocery warehouse was the big brick building there, or former grocery warehouse. What I found interesting here is you just have a short little stub track, and if you looked under that canopy, didn't have good digital cameras then, or didn't have digital cameras then, period. But you had a belt from the line shaft in the mill came out to a pulley and then was belted down. And so if you were doing bulk loading of grain or bulk unloading of grain, you could shove the car in that little short stub, and that way you didn't block access to the 2 warehouses across the street. You know, closer up of that, you know, the brick warehouse was built in the early 1900s. The stone warehouse on the left was built in 1780. So again, you have an ancient building, and just kind of a neat, to me, little cubbyhole the way the car was shoved back in there. I suspect whatever they were getting off that car was going into the brick warehouse, which by this time was a a local furniture discounter. Um, Looking up the street, there was a baking company which in the 30s made crackers for Campbell's soup, which they had sold along with their soup, shipped by the team track. There was no direct track connection. By this time, they were making animal food for NIH was their primary business. Walking east a couple hundred yards, you come to Wisner Street. This industry was at the formerly the Baltimore, Washington White Cross Milk Company, which became a part of Chestnut Farm or Seal Test. But this track was designed that you could put milk refrigerator cars in here and unload them into the dairy. And then on the right side, you had half of a Quonset hut. A little bit further east, it still had a scale house. Now you're looking back, you can see that half a Quonset hut there by the scale house and the dairy, and there were a couple other industries on that track as well. The track going to your left went to a brickyard and then also connected with a former H&F branch, Hagerstown and Frederick branch, which went up the hill to the Farmers Co-op. And this was in '68, but if you go back 15 years earlier, Charlie Hauser was there, and this mill was being switched with this contraption, which had formerly worked for W&OD and then had been purchased by H&F for freight service up there. Later on, when you got a camera, you'd watch them get there and could watch them switch sometimes. They might go out and work the stone quarry at Grove. And here they are working in the yard. Note that you have a crewman posted there on the left to convey signals from the conductor, which would have been on back out of sight, to the engineer, or relay signals, I guess is the word. This is kind of a gritty neighborhood in this era, 1970 or so. If you go there now, it's the MARC stations here, and you know, all these places have been gentrified, and you know, you can't buy them for a lot of money. Here again, we're making a runaround move at the scale house. If you were lucky, you would get something going up to Farmers Co-op again. I'm not sure if I was lucky here or not with that C&O piece of junk on there. Hopefully I didn't insult too many people with that. Sometimes if there was a car that needed to be spotted quickly down at Frederick Junction, you would see the engine just pick up the caboose and away they would go, and down to the branch line they would go. This area is now an industrial park. The MARC maintenance garage is there. It's no longer out in the middle of nowhere like it looks here. Another place that wound up spending a lot of time just watching the crews switch cars was a place called Millville, which was about 4 miles down, or actually up the Shenandoah River from Harper's Ferry. And there was a church parking lot that you could just park in and watch them there. Sometimes in the wintertime, they would still be going to town at night. And again, everything was kind of orderly. You know, the track was arranged for them to get their work done. Here's the scale house again. Also spent a lot of time rail fanning. I will confess that I was pretty much an armchair model railroader in the late 60s and 70s, but spent a lot of time out with a camera, and sometimes you would spend a fair amount of time in talking with operators. And this is Mr. Flora at Big Pool Junction on the Western Maryland, and can remember being in there talking to him. And then there was another fellow that came on at 4 o'clock named Vince Dunnigan, who would talk your ears off. And it wasn't unusual to show up there at 4 o'clock and leave the tower with him when he went off duty at midnight. Our misspent youth, I reckon. Lots of fascinating stuff in here, including you know, a phone system that worked on a speaker. And sometimes you'd be sitting there if the dispatcher needed to call you, and the thing would start going in and go clunk, to clunk, a clunk, to clunk, a clunk. And then at the very end, it would go. And you're thinking, well, what a poor excuse for a phone system that is. But interesting place. And you got a sense of, again, what the railroad was doing, and how it worked, how long it took for things to happen. And finally, around maybe 1980, he got around to finally building a railroad. And a couple of you on here who know me are probably looking back there and thinking, God, is that actually a hill covered with trees? Scenery? John? No, couldn't be. Well, be that as it may, right now you need to enjoy plywood on my railroad, but whatever. All hand-built track, and or at least hand-built turnouts or switches. And we had a lot of fun with it for a while, but looking back at it, it was terrible. I mean, you had the gimmicky switching area with gotchas and stuff like that, and the little short switchback, which I guess I thought was cute. But you never got around to working it during an operating session because you needed this yard to be available to sort the cars out in order to get in there. And this was a stub-in yard, so trains would come out of staging. They would have to reverse here in order to go over the rest of the layout. So you'd have the yard crew here would, you know, work themselves to death just to keep the trains on the main line. They never had time to fool around with the switching area. So I'd wind up doing that the next day. It did have a good dispatcher's office. It was patterned after to kind of look like a tower up in Mount Airy, complete with, if you push the red button and then the white button on that box there to your left, a phone system that went clunk a clunk a clunk, clunk a clunk a clunk, and then gave you the raspberry. And what the raspberry was, it turns out, was an answer back to the dispatcher or whoever was making the call that showed him that the phone that he was trying to ring was actually ringing. So finally decided, you know, trying to figure out what to do, you know, and finally decided on the branch down to Winchester because you could put crews out there who would have something to do. And you could use that dispatcher's office. Obviously, you can't model everything. For instance, Harper's Ferry could be pretty much a room size layout in and of itself, but there wouldn't be much action there. Well, it could be plenty of action. You'd just be all through trains. There would be no switching or anything like that. So kind of decided to, eliminate that. The other end of the line was Strasburg Junction, and try to do that. Big part of any track planning is not so much what to include, but what not to include. Well, there were a lot of things here not to include, so that kind of cleans it up a little bit. That's more or less the track plan. Winchester had been built at the time this was published by Kalmbach. And this showed just a slight little bit of Millville, Halltown, which would have been kind of a neat place, and Charlestown, and then Summit Point, which was just out in the middle of nowhere, still is. What eventually happened is that track from staging comes through about right here and just loops around. And this whole area is Millville. And then Charlestown is here. And what that did is it opens up this space, which I think is worth its weight in gold, because people can congregate here if you're having an open house, and you can fan the breeze with people, and be in the layout and actually have room to stand. By utilizing space in essence from here to here for Millville, you can kind of do it right, and you'd have room to do Charlestown reasonably well as well. So let's see, I didn't want to go back, I wanted to go in this direction. So again, you have Millville here. The caboose and the two cars are on the lead to standard lime and stone. Here's a scale track in my finger. And the track is pretty much the same as it is in real life, or was in real life. It's been simplified a lot now by CSX. But it works. And it works because, some civil engineer who's probably buried in a cemetery somewhere up in Baltimore figured out what worked, and I just copied it. Not that I'm lazy or anything, but I don't have much of an imagination to come up with something good. Charlestown is the next station on the line, in weather like today. Photos down here in the steam era are basically non-existent, unfortunately. And so, one of the challenges you have is trying to model things. Now, if you go to the museum in Charlestown and you're trying to figure out if your ancestor, marched with Stonewall Jackson, they can fix you up there. If you're looking for a picture of the mill that was here before 1956, you're pretty much out of luck. So this is a 1957 built mill. The question I have is, do you try to build this, or do you do a guess based on a Sanborn map of what it might have looked like in the old days? Again, the track is pretty much what was there. This is during an operating session, and two-man crew. One change I did make out of necessity was I had to move the interchange track with the N&W from the east end of town, which basically would have taken off to our right and gone through the backdrop. And I moved it to the west end of town, which is in the distance. That, to me, did not materially affect the way this place works. Next station is Winchester. Again, pretty much go with what was there. And it's actually shortened. This makes it look like things are actually longer in the model form than in the real life, and obviously that's not true. You know, going up a little bit further, you know, you have Southern States to your left was an odd building that was up on posts. There's the model of it, also up on posts. This is a Paul Dolphus photo. So it's all in focus as opposed to mine, which aren't. This is out of focus, but it's just a small postage stamp style blow up of an 8x10 aerial photo from the Hagley Library up in Wilmington. Apparently the pilot that Pennsylvania Railroad hired to photograph their railroad got a little confused when he got to Winchester and took a picture of the B&O instead. You can't win them all. And boy, lots of things in here. You got Esso to your far left, Robinson Cold Storage, and they also sold coal. You've got a Herbert Bryant in the right in the center, and then there was the Cooperative Fruits Exchange to your right in the foreground. All customers. Here we are around 1971 or 2 or something like that. Well, actually a little later than that, because I see a chassis engine. Can't win them all. You know, this is Robinson Cold Storage. And you can see one of the crossovers that was there, and there was another one just about where I'm standing that had been removed by the time of this picture. And here we are, same place in the basement. And then the switch stand in the foreground is for the missing crossover. Again, looking at the other direction, yeah, that's your local engine that works in Winchester all the time. And basically I used the pointer, and you know, you've got one crossover here, and what you needed was a second crossover here, which you could put a car here and then just do a quick runaround. And that's what Jack was telling me. And, you know, when I first built this, I was planning on ending the passing siding here, which was kind of been ridiculous to have a crossover right there. But I figured out that if you brought the passing siding around here, you could store a lot more stuff there. And you kind of need it sometimes. So, you know, second crossover gives me the short runaround. Again, it took a railroader to recognize that. I never did. You know, this is a kind of comparison of what it looked like in 1939. And apparently I deleted the other diagram, whatever. Can't win them all. Just thought I'd show you while we were here, you know, the switch lanterns actually can turn to indicate the position of the switch points, and then they're controlled from a little hand throw, which is on the shelf in front of the layout. You know, apples were a big part of the business in Winchester, so you try to celebrate those with this collection of field boxes. Trains tend to congregate sometimes at Winchester. I don't know if any of the crew people who worked this ever used that second crossover for a short runaround or not, but it's short. I can see now where it comes in handy, because if you have two trains that you need to put in hiding, say to let the passenger train by, it allows you to basically use the one long passing siding as two shorter ones. So the crossovers get a lot of use, probably not for what reason that, the railroad or engineer wanted me to put it there for. Stevens City is sort of the way it was, but I had to make changes. Otherwise, the passing siding would have started in Winchester, which wouldn't have been much good. And then that brings us around to Strasburg Junction. Well, this is the way it was drawn again in the map. At the time when I was originally planning, what really happened was it brought this around and just took it through this doorway and into to the southern here. And then this, when I first started out, this came out on a peninsula, and I had some of the Strasburg Junction industries here. Well, that didn't work, and changed it around a little bit, and eventually got it to the point where you still have the Y for Strasburg Junction here, but now you have the Pout and Lime Company here, which is where it is supposed to be. In essence, if Winchester is where my pointer is here, and where that tells us it is, this is the Pout and Lime Company, and then this is your interchange track, and then this is the Southern's main line between Harrisonburg and Manassas. And the reason the B&O is dotted here is because this is actually a Southern map, not a B&O map. But take what you can get. Big industry there is Pout and Lime Company. They had this stone loader. As you can see, most of the Lime Company buildings are pretty well falling down at this point. Again, you do the best you can. This was a stone loader that they had built in later years for fluxing stone for steel industry. That's about it. Let's see, 40 minutes. Hopefully it didn't put too many people to sleep. And I thank you. So now I have to get out of stop share, right? Aha.
Correct.
And there we are. So let's see, hopefully I didn't put too many people into a coma here, into sleep. Any questions, comments? You think I'm crazy? Silence.
Well, everybody's muted. If you want to speak, you need to unmute yourself to speak, okay?
John, I had a couple of questions for you. Just drawing on your commentary, it seems like you've copied the prototype and included things that many model railroaders tend to simplify out or whatever, namely to include, multiple Y tracks and double-ended industrial sidings and perhaps multiple similar interests. I know in your layout, I think you have 2 or more retail fuel dealers on the same siding. Wonder if you could comment on some of this.
Well, again, you need to go up to Baltimore and find the cemetery where the civil engineer that laid it out is buried and talk to them to find out why. In Winchester, there are actually 3 fuel dealers on one track, plus a fertilizer warehouse. That was actually a team track. I think it's listed as a team track simply because the land where the fuel dealers was located, as well as the fertilizer, was all owned by B&O. And CSX recently sold it. It's all now, you know, Housing for Humanity or whatever it's called. But the only reason I do it is because that's the way B&O did it. It's nothing clever on my part. And the same there at Charlestown. Doug, I think you and Travers were actually working that in the picture I had. That it was, you have multiple industries on the track because there were multiple industries on the track. And, turnouts and switches are expensive for the railroad to build. And I guess they just felt that was the best way of doing it.
I guess I was making the observation that it seems like prototype railroads would sometimes double end some of the industrial spurs when model railroaders, in order to save money, might have a simple spur. And the comment about the multiple fuel oil dealers is that many model railroaders think they have to have one of everything. And they don't realize that it was a competitive business and that you might have a Shell oil dealer and a Sunoco or something competing for the local business. And so they'd need retail establishments. Same with coal trestles. So I don't know if you can comment about
trestles. I mean, in Winchester, you had, there was a Conoco dealer in South Winchester, which I don't include because the basement's only so big. And then as you went up north, you had, let's see, I will eventually have a Sinclair dealer up at the east end of Winchester. But you had, a whole branch line for, industrial track that would, if you were doing it in a basement, would occupy the aisle, which would kind of make actually operating the railroad a little tough, I think. But you had, Gulf, Texaco. There was a propane dealer, and there was one other up there. But there are more unmodeled fuel dealers in Winchester than there are ones that I've modeled, if that makes sense.
John, a question has been put up, what the status of construction is of your layout and how far are you along in construction as related to track versus scenery?
Who asked that?
Mr. Stormer.
Okay, well, that's well, I find it, let's put it this way. Track is basically complete unless I were to complete, add a little bit more on the southern going down towards Harrisonburg. There's space there opposite Charlestown where you could put Woodstock or Newmarket or one of the places like that going on down the branch. And then there's a place where you could put a 1 or 2 track, well, it'd be about a 2-track staging yard representing Harrisonburg on the southern. I don't know if I'm ever going to build that because, crew utilization right now works out pretty good. And one thing you would have is that you have people in Charlestown a lot of the time during an operating session. And if you had somebody trying to share that rather narrow aisle there, while they were working the southern, you would wind up people becoming friends, becoming enemies. So no point in, nothing to be gained by building it. So I would say the track is complete. Scenery, I have a couple trees in one corner, which is kind of my version of the local national forest. And whenever I start thinking about building buildings and planting trees, I go back to becoming an armchair railroader. So I'm thinking one of these days, but right now, I would say the track is 100% complete. Scenery is 1% complete.
John, one aspect of scenery where I think you've paid attention, and I think it adds operating interest, are the grade crossings. You know, in Winchester, you have to think about splitting your train, placing the car spots away from the cross traffic. I think Charlestown, I think, is the same way. And so even in the Plywood Pacific stage, you can mock up the road with a magic marker and maybe label it for the name of the street and get some play value just out of a simple magic marker kind of scenery.
Well, I've generally paved the streets already, so people know where they are.
Another aspect of this, John, is that how often are the individual industries switched? Model railroaders seem to feel compelled that every industry has to be switched in every run of the way freight. But I get the impression that quite a few industries are switched, you know, only a few times a week, maybe even only a few times a month. Can you say something about that and choices the listeners might want to hear about what to do?
It depends on the commodity. You know, if you have a hopper car on a coal trestle, you know, you go down there and you open the, open the gates, and you can probably unload that pretty quick. There was a fella up in the Philadelphia area, Ken McCory. His family ran a fuel dealer, and he said that when a tank car would come in, that would be unloaded and released within a day. So I don't leave, tank cars come in on one session, they go out on the next session. On the other hand, if there was some bag commodity being unloaded at a feed mill, you didn't get that done in a day. Or if you had a carload of stick lumber come in, you didn't unload that in a day. So those cars would have to be left in place, and it complicates things a little bit when you have a long industrial track that you have to respot some of these cars. The other one, that there's one coal yard there in Charlestown which gets coal in gondola cars. Well, not too many people could get in there with a scoop shovel and empty a gon in one day.
Could I ask you, John, you're obviously big on track work and are squeamish about scenery and structures, but when you operate on somebody else's layout, is it more fun to operate when they have structures present, or what's your feeling about it? I'm not trying to make you feel guilty.
Well, I feel guilty whether you're trying to make me guilty or not.
Okay.
Yeah, of course it's more fun when you on a place there and you can study a nice building that somebody's built. I can remember one time, I think you most Bill and Mary Miller up in Middletown, and for some reason the DCC system was acting up there, and you're just sitting there, and I'm studying the buildings, and I could have sat there all night just looking at the detail on those things and studying them out. So of course it makes it helps, but on the other hand, I've been to places where there's no scenery whatsoever, and just signs saying where the industries are, and you get into it and you you do what you got to do, and you don't get that initial big bang, but as you're sitting there and working, doing the switching and all is just as complex. If you're switching cars to a sign that says it's the, sanitary dairy or something like that, as you are if there's actually a dairy building there. Now, it's a little bit, you don't have to worry about, or you don't have the challenge rather of trying to put the car at the proper place at the dock if you're just switching to a sign.
The other thing I wanted to ask you too is, do you have any provision for through freights or through passenger, or is this strictly a switching layout?
It's a branch line. It connects with the Southern. I probably interchange 7 or 8 cars with the Southern during a session, which is, my guess is I'm interchanging as many cars with the Southern during one session as the real railroads did in a week or two. It wasn't a major gateway. So in essence, I've got a fairly large staging yard, and trains run out of there by the time they get to Strasburg Junction. And if they have to switch to the Powhatan Lime Company and there's a pulpwood yard there, there's not much left to switch to the Southern. The passenger train runs to Strasburg on the Southern. It keeps things honest a little bit by, gives you something to think about. One thing I forgot to mention during the program is I use real time. You have in the dispatcher's office and in the staging area and the real B&O clocks, the clock that keeps time at Strasburg Junction was the clock that kept time at the real Strasburg Junction. So it's got seniority over all of us. I find that it helps you. You don't have to think about, going through calculations of what's going on. And then it kind of goes back to where it was in Gaithersburg, where you were there, you always knew had a sense of what was going on. It was kind of dictated by that one passenger train that came out of DC. And, you just knew what was going on at any particular time you happened to show up there. And it's the same thing. I don't have to go back in the railroad during an operating session. I just sit out where the operator is, and he's got a squawk box on the phone, and I can pretty much tell what's going on just by listening to the conversations between the train crews and the operator and the dispatcher. And you also have warning lights.
I'm in it right now.
Do you think this real-time works for you? Do you think this would work on a bigger layout, or what's your experience on?
Well, bigger layouts, one of the things that they can do, which I don't do, is they operate on a 24-hour basis. So with the 24-hour basis, you stop and then they just pick up where they left off after the previous session. So that works. If you were doing that with a real time, it might take you 6 months to get through one day. And I don't think that would be much fun. But the Shenandoah sub, basically went to sleep at night. So, you know, the crew that showed up to work the shift between midnight and 8 a.m., you know, I'd need to make sure I had a couple cases of beer for them because there wouldn't be anything else to do.
John, can you say something about how you used three-man crews sometimes in Winchester, and that you had a freight agent or an agent at a desk helping out, add interest to the activity?
Sometimes I have an agent there if I'm really feather bedding. Not something we do nowadays. Is you put an agent there who's also turns out to be can be the operator, and he's basically creating switch lists, and then you'd have an engineer and conductor. And when it was just Winchester, one time I remember had 3 people there actually doing the work. You had an engineer, you had a conductor, and then you had someone who was basically on the ground between them, who was like throwing a lot of the turnouts or switches, and sometimes making cuts at the direction of the conductor. So that worked out pretty good. Generally 2 people is all you want during a regular operating session. 2 people is all you want at Winchester. When I have 3, they get in each other's way unless one of them is willing to just sit at the desk and be the agent and operator.